So the coded reference to the obsequious Chesterfield is, I trust, obvious. So that's a picture of Wiley Griffin. So earliest recorded, he was a muleteer. The reason I talk about him is because he's the first African American mentioned in the historical record. It's currently a project in collaboration with the LCCVSU to place a historical marker at his at his gravesite in the Masonic Cemetery. He made his home overlooking the mill race in what is now eWeb's employee parking lot. In an obituary, he was described as one of the most industrious colored men in Eugene. He's remembered for having a ready smile, a kind word, being devout and devoted Christian, and a man who never drank or used profanity. In another obituary, he was remembered as, quote, what a Southerner would call a good nigger, unquote. All right, so good nigger, so to speak, is by definition not uppity. He knew his place. And one of the things that I point out in terms of the history is it's interesting that the people that are living in Eugene at the time, and since he's one of them, they are not remembered in the historical record, but he is. And not just because he has a public position. So he died at home without a will. His estate included groceries. Somebody took care of him, but he had no family in town. The Elks paid for his funeral in the Masonic Cemetery, and 8 years after his death, the Elks would actually become one of the nuclei of the Eugene Klan. And there was a headstone until 1959, but it's gone, so we're replacing it with a historical marker. They don't know. They say it was lost. I'm not sure. How do you lose a headstone? I'm just saying. What I was quoted, and so that's why we're replacing it with something that'll be harder to lose. Way harder to lose. So, the idea that individuals like Moses Harris and Wiley Griffin were tolerated because they were not so quote unquote uppity. And we haven't talked about Martin Delany yet, right? First black major officer in history for the U.S. Army. So, born in the South, he resorted to learning how to read and write illegally. Due to his continued desire to learn, he later settled in New York, where he attended the African Free School. Between 1843 and 46, he published his own newspaper, The Mystery. Subsequently, he worked for Frederick Douglass on his weekly newspaper, The Northern Star. He entered Harvard Medical School as one of its first black students. In 1859, he traveled to Africa, where he stayed for nearly a year, searching for a suitable location for immigration. So Lincoln wasn't the only person that wanted black people to go to Costa Rica or leave. There were black people that wanted to go back to Africa too, that were pretty intent on okay, we're not going to make it here, let's just leave. So during the Civil War, received the commission of major in the Federal Army, the first black man to receive a commission like that. Accomplished author. His favorite subject was history. One of his books, The Principia of Ethnology, The Origin of Races in Color, with an archaeological compendium of Ethiopian and Egyptian civilization from years of careful examination and inquiry, first published in 1879, and detailed the African origins of Nile Valley civilizations. So he's like the Molefe Asante of his time, without taking on an African name. The racial and historical consciousness of Delaney is apparent in the names he gave his kids. Ramses Placido, named after the mighty Egyptian pharaoh, Isamari Ramses II, and the Cuban poet and revolutionary Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez, who wrote under the pen name Placido. Now, if you note the time of this Cuban, the island of Cuba had been actually seen as a model for black liberation for some time among people like Delaney. He, in fact, wrote a book that basically looked at a revolution of slaves in Cuba. His other children included Alexander Dumas, Saint Cyprien, and Toussaint Louverture Delaney. Frederick Douglass said of Delaney, "I thank God for making me a man simply, but Delaney always thanks him for making him a black man." So this is, you can actually find this in Google Docs. The condition, elevation, emigration, and destiny of the colored people of the United States, politically considered. And Blake, the hero of his novel Blake or the Huts of America, West Indian who travels throughout the South advocating revolution and becomes the general of an African insurrectionary force in Cuba. Blake hopes that with a victorious insurrection in Cuba and the expulsion of all Americans from Cuba, Cuba's model African state will lead to the downfall of slavery in the United States. Interesting dream at the time. So part of the historical experience of African American soldiers, Martin Delaney, on the other side, Fort Pillow, and Cathay Williams, who turned out to be a woman, served in the Union forces as a man. Black woman, naturally. And the Buffalo Soldiers, with their experience at San Juan Hill, which is out of the time period, but I basically just mentioned them. So, one of the things, you cannot actually consider the African American experience in the United States without looking at our adversaries. The Klan, oppression by conclusion. So when you want to hide the true origins of intentions of something, use obfuscation. So most scholarly references to the Klan pointed out as being rooted in harmless fun engaged by those who have time on their hands after the war. So for example, recall Nathan Bedford Forrest's actions at Fort Pillow. Confederates lost, and they're not going to simply sit and let their inferiors have an advantage. So, Ku Klux Klan was an outgrowth of peculiar conditions, and even though, which prevailed at the time between 65 and 1869, is as much a product of those conditions as malaria is of a swamp and sun heat. Birthplace was Pulaski, the capital of Giles, one of the southern tier of counties in Middle Tennessee. Pulaski was a town of 2,500 to 3,000 inhabitants. Previous to the war, the people possessed wealth and culture. The first was lost in the general wreck. Now the most intimate associations with them fail to disclose a trace of the diabolism which, according to the popular idea, one would expect to find characterizing the people among who the Ku Klux Klan originated. A male college and a female seminary are located in Pulaski and receive liberal patronage. It's a town of churches. There, in 1866, the name Ku Klux first fell from human lips. There began a movement which in short time spread as far north as Virginia and as far south as Texas. That's in the first wave, and which for a period convulsed the country. Proclamations were fulminated against the Klan by the president and governors of states, that is, in the late 19th century, and hostile statutes were enacted by both the state and national legislatures for their become associated with the name of the Ku Klux Klan gross mistakes and lawless deeds of violence. During the entire period of the Klan's organized existence, Pulaski continued to be its central seat of authority, and some of its highest officers resided there. This narrative then will basically talk about the growth of the Klan. Now, one of the things that I talk about, or is interesting to note about the Klan, is that they're essentially an invisible empire operating within the United States. So, for example, a Grand Cyclops. A Cyclops is a presiding officer, a Grand Magi or vice president, a Grand Turk or marshal, a Grand Exchequer or treasurer, 2 lictors, who were the inner and outer guards of the den as the place of meeting, and Kliegels and other forms of officers. So one obligation was to maintain secrecy, and if you were also a part of other fraternal organizations like Masons and things like that, then you were also welcome. You were also welcome pretty much if you're white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and you actually had to at least be able to testify to that or prove that one way or the other. These are some early Klan costumes, which since in its early foundings it was essentially an illegal organization. So each member was required to provide himself with the following: a white mask for the face with orifices for the eyes and nose, a tall, fantastic cardboard hat so constructed to increase the wearer's apparent height, a gown or robe of sufficient length to cover the entire person, no particular color. These were left to the individual's taste and fancies, and each selected what in his judgment would be the most hideous and fantastic, with the aim of inspiring the greatest amount of awe in the novice and also fear in the targets. So, Birth of a Nation was basically is the movie that was essentially detailing the birth of the invisible empire. So the illusion again is that the Klan was disbanded after a particular time and was a social club. Okay, so some clans used all white robes regardless of rank. And for those that use robes of different color, most use purple for the Imperial Wizard, green for the Grand Dragon, maroon, a Great Titan, black for a Nighthawk. And there's also red robes for those who are allowed into the Klan who aren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, but either Italian or German or Swedish. So officially they were disbanded, but the reality was they just simply went underground. So as an example then, setting the stage for what was to come later, the first election in the South was in Alexandria, Virginia, and the election commissioners refused to count 1,400 black votes. The military suspends local elections pending a clarification of the status of the freedmen. That is, wait, we just had constitutional amendments giving them the vote. What's there to clarify exactly? So in Reconstruction, acts by Congress to divide the South into 5 military districts under the command of generals. So the elections were ordered for constitutional conventions. Military has to order the status of blacks to be changed in many cases, even though the Constitution de jure says that you're a citizen now. So Reconstruction starts with voting. You had to have constitutional conventions to rewrite constitutions of the southern states to allow blacks to be elected. So this also allows black policemen, jurors, and eventually lawyers, judges, senators, and congressional representatives. So for example, PBS Pinchback from Mississippi. Hiram Revels, a U.S. Senator from Mississippi. Blanche Kelso Bruce, another senator from Mississippi. And Robert Greener, who was a famous college professor at the University of South Carolina. South Carolina, and the Bar of District of Columbia, and conferred by Monrovia College in Liberia, another doctorate, and was honored with another doctorate at Howard. Brother with lots of degrees, and he put them to use. Dean of Howard's Law Department in 1881, and a private law practice in Washington, D.C. So that Civil Rights Bill of 1875, all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privilege of inns, public conveyances on land or water, theaters, and other places of public amusement, subject only to the conditions and limitations established by law and applicable to citizens of every race and color, regardless of any previous condition of servitude. So, if you read between the lines, as well as the English, what this basically says is that there will be no more peanut gallery in the theaters. Peanut gallery. The last two rows of the balcony were for people of color, meaning blacks, only. If you've heard the phrase, no comments from the peanut gallery. Okay? You can go to like Ashland, Oregon, and the side entrance was the black-only entrance of the theater that's on that main drag there. Okay? There were blacks-only entrances at the McDonald Theater, which we're not getting to that time period yet, but this was a segregated city in the South. So in the South, basically, everything was segregated. Water fountains, theaters, sit at the back of the bus if you could ride the bus at all, neighborhoods, all that stuff, set up by law. And this civil rights law in 1875 is attempting to change that. It's federal, but the states will decide whether or not they will enforce it, as we shall see. So, sounds good on paper, but when you go to a restaurant or theater and they won't serve you or let you in, where do you go to complain? When the police arrest you because I won't leave a restaurant, where do you go to complain? The feds will do nothing, because that is basically considered like a private business. And we see that issue today. Should the feds intrude on the rights of a private business and or states' rights? So let's stop here. And we'll do final prep as well as finish up on Wednesday. Doris's.